Is science nothing but a progression of exploded theories? Is all knowledge only relative, never fully validated? Never absolute, immutable, or certain? Hello, I'm Cody Leibold. Welcome to the Objectivism book study, where we are discussing the book Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand by Leonard Peikoff. What can Christians learn from the unique philosophical system of objectivism? That's what we're discussing. And today looking at the concepts of certainty and comparing the objectivist theory of certainty to other ideas such as mysticism and skepticism. So we're looking at pages 171 through 186. We're going to pick up a couple of threads from last week's discussion where we had been looking at the idea of the arbitrary. Now, we had looked at the idea of the arbitrary as understood by objectivism, and Andrew Boone and I were discussing the topic over Facebook Messenger this week to figure out exactly what is Leonard Peikoff saying here. So Andrew had wanted to know, doesn't every claim, as long as it is simple, as long as it is well-formed, not ambiguous, as long as it refers to something in reality, doesn't it need to be either true or false? Now, as I understand it, the objectivist answer to this question is, well, if the claim does refer to something in reality, if it's making the attempt to reason from the observed information to conclusions, then it doesn't get called arbitrary. But this is the issue, is does the person making the claim attempt to connect the claim to reality? And if they have made no attempt, then the objectivist would say that their claim is neither true nor false within the context of their thinking. And this would also be true if somebody else were to hear their claim but not know how to connect it to reality. The example I used last week was my son tells me that he thinks the moon is brighter than the sun, and let's say he had dreamed it. And now I pointed out that's not really a method of connecting your observations to your conclusions because it's not really an observation. And perhaps I could even make a slightly better analogy, would be what if he just said, because I think so, because I wish it is, because I want it to be. That would even be a more clear example of an arbitrary statement. And I could say to my son, you've given me no evidence, but I am aware of, in my context of evidence and my objective, not arbitrary, but objective approach, I'm able to say to my son, we could go look at the evidence together and we could evaluate that claim within a new context. And in that new context, you can say, no, your claim is false because there's something else that's the opposite, which is true. Andrew was wanting to know, okay, wait a minute. The term arbitrary then, it refers to the way that somebody approaches the question of determining knowledge. It refers to something in the state of the person thinking. And the answer is yes, Andrew is right about that. And so we had this discussion back and forth a bit, and he said that'd be okay if I share everything that I had given to him as ideas about this. Are you connecting your claims to observed data? That's the question that would answer, is this arbitrary or not? Here's some extra notes that I had shared with Andrew. So what Peikoff is doing is asking you to reevaluate your definition of the term true and false. This is new information, and we're so used to the idea of true and false. It's not easy mentally to say, I'm just going to rethink how I use that term. And I had a similar experience when I was in college. I took a class on logic, and one of the first lessons was that the term valid refers to something about syllogisms. A syllogism could be valid even if it has false conclusions, even if it has false premises, as long as it's constructed according to the rules of syllogisms. Valid in logic means follows the rules of syllogisms, not that it's true. And so I had this experience of having to learn new vocabulary. I had to be adaptable in my mind to learn this new vocabulary. And I think that's what was going on with Andrew was, okay, sure, we can accept a new definition of true, but then he asked himself, doesn't that mean that if we try to communicate with people that don't know this new definition, it's going to be confusing to them? And I agreed with him, yeah, you shouldn't just go around telling people this new definition and treating it like they have to accept it. What you can do is if somebody makes an arbitrary claim, you don't have to say that's neither true nor false. Instead of doing that, what you would want to do is just tell them that's a claim that is made without evidence. You're being arbitrary here. And they'll understand that. You don't have to insist on telling them it's neither true nor false.
What is the definition that he was operating under previously? Do you know?
What was Andrew's definition of true?
Yeah. Did he articulate it?
Okay, so I don't think he expressed it, but it would have been something like the words map to reality. The words conform to reality, which is fine, except for there's one detail that's missing.
How
And
do they conform?
yes, and so what Peikoff is pointing out is that the words in one context, in one mental context, could conform to reality or be attempting to. And then in a different context, maybe they're not even attempting to. And so this is one of those issues where it's a framing issue. It's not that there's a disagreement, it's just a question of, well, yes, but this is the way that we are using that information as we go about our life. The objectivist would be willing to look at it and say, every claim is being used by a mind. And actually, that's something that we've discussed in previous videos and chapters. We've talked about the objective theory of concepts always accounts for the role of the active mind. And so that's all that the objectivists are adding to the concept here, is they're saying we also account for the role of the mind in coming to a truth. And they would just say, if you haven't had an active mind following a method, then we haven't even reached the status of true or false yet. This is something of an issue of convention, of terminology. And like we said with a Punnett square, so if you had a Punnett square and you're looking at two different questions, is the person attempting to follow a method or not? And then do they successfully reach an idea that maps to reality or not? That yields 4 options. Well, Andrew was looking at it and saying that anything that successfully maps to reality, whether it was conceived arbitrarily or not, ought to be labeled true. And Peikoff is saying we're going to reserve the label true only for those things that meet both criteria. I think it's a matter of convention. I think we could come up with more terms, but I argued to Andrew that if you wanted to use the conventions the way that he had assumed, then you're missing a term that's more specific. No matter what, we're going to have to use a big pile of words to successfully describe what it is that we're talking about, because we're so used to using the word true or the word false within the assumption that I am following a reality-oriented method. So to me, it's a step back to say, well, somebody could be making a claim without even using that method. I would probably suggest these as terms. Does the claim map to reality? Does the claim attempt to follow a method that's reality-oriented? And then if both, then I would say true. You can have any combination of those factors. Okay, questions about that before we move forward? So I think Peikoff is advocating a specific convention. And he does offer a reason for why we should use the convention, so it is objective. But that's not to say that it's just false to use some other set of conventions. But he wants to differentiate between claims made within a reality-oriented context and those that are not. So 2 plus 2 equals 4. If that was stated by somebody who did not know the meaning of 2 or plus or equals or 4, then what Peikoff is saying, like if a young child memorized the expression 2 plus 2 is 4, then to that child's mind, that statement is neither true nor false. Because when we use the word true, what we are referring to, at least within the objectivist use of the terms, what we're referring to by true is a mind in contact with reality. And in this case, the child's mind, when he makes that expression, is not connecting anything in reality. Yeah, go ahead, Isaac.
Yeah, I think that's a good distinction, because it's sort of weird, and I understand where Andrew's coming from, because it's sort of weird to suggest that you could be presented with a claim that you yourself can map to reality. And what that means is I can see a path, a method, a validation that is valid and can lead me to that claim, to the truth of that claim. But to then also say that you might call that claim arbitrary still, because it depends on who made the claim or where the claim is coming from. And the reason for that, like you've been saying, we are individualists, or however you want to put that. It matters where the claim is coming from, because the relevance of truth has to do with people interacting with it. So just because I can map a claim to the truth doesn't mean that the person who's making the claim is actually dealing with reality. And that matters. It matters for that person to actually be dealing with reality, because you don't know if this person is making an arbitrary claim. You know, they've just threw a dart in the dark and got a bullseye, but they're still throwing darts in the dark, and they'll probably stab you in the eye soon. So it matters. Even though I can map it to the truth, Are you making an arbitrary claim? And if so, I'm going to call it arbitrary to get you to deal with reality.
Yes, I agree with everything you're saying there. Calling it arbitrary, it's useful. We need to have the ability to have that description. Now, Andrew was saying that, okay, I understand having that distinction, but how can you say that the claim is neither true nor false? And of course, it's just a matter of definition here. The claim could be evaluated within a different context and it would be true or false. That's the point. But within the context that it is being made, it is neither true nor false. That is how the objectivists think about that. And I pointed out to Andrew, okay, look, not all utterances are claims, but some are. And then not all claims are properly formed. Like there could be the idea like, do you still beat your wife? Yes or no. Like, see, it's a complex claim and it has two pieces to it. And one of them is being assumed. So there's a problem with the claim there. Cast that aside and say that there's a properly formed claim. Say it's grammatical, it's coherent, not self-contradictory internally. So then we'd say that the claim is properly formed. But then the next question is, was it formed in a reality-oriented mental context? And that will tell you whether it's objective or arbitrary. And then, if it passes all those tests and it's objective, you still have to ask yourself, is it true? Because somebody could follow an objective method and reach a false conclusion because they lacked knowledge. So objective refers to method. Objective is not the same thing as true. All right, so then after I explained that to Andrew, he said, yeah, okay, I still wouldn't necessarily want to use the phrase neither true nor false because it would confuse an audience. And I told him, yeah, that's a good policy. You just don't need to confuse your audience. And then I pointed out to him a couple other things. So truth is mind dependent on the objectivist theory. That's what we're getting at here. There's a distinction between the idea of a fact versus a truth. Fact is our term for when we're referring to things that are maybe that are known by us, but that we're not specifically referring to the fact that they are known by us. It's just outside of us. It's either it is a fact or it isn't. Whereas when we use the word truth, we're referring to a fact that is being held by a mind. That's why within the objectivist theory, we say that it is a mind-dependent term, the word truth or the word falsehood. And if the mind has not attempted to map to reality at all, then we say that there's nothing mind-dependent about the utterance or the claim. It's arbitrary. So on Peikoff's definitions, a statement could be a fact regardless of whether any mind knows it. A statement can only be a truth if there's a mind that is doing the work to connect the idea to observation. And once you understand this convention and the intended purpose for it, you can evaluate the usefulness of this convention yourself. But the purpose of the convention is you need to account simultaneously for the role of the mind and the role of reality in thought. So we reserve the term truth for cases of minds perceiving this connection of the idea to observation, connection of the mind to reality. Now, if you were on the intrinsicist approach of knowledge that we'd been discussing in previous weeks, then you would see no need for this, because the intrinsicist approach does not treat the active role of the mind as a necessary aspect of all concepts. But on the objectivist approach, where we're distinguishing facts from truths, we're going to look at a claim that is factual, that maps to the facts, but that has been asserted arbitrarily, and we're going to say that that is not a truth to the mind that asserted it. That's what we're saying. And at the same time, it can be a truth to somebody who does know how to tie it to reality. True in the context of a working mind. Now, if Peikoff is correct, I think he is, then for a lot of people, this is going to take a mental shift to embrace this new use of the term. Speaking of something being true apart from it being true to a specific mind would be incoherent, according to objectivism. It'd be like if you were to go out into the forest and you were to say, this tree is the favorite one, without saying whose favorite one. It's a nonsensical statement. If there was a single tree and you said, this is taller than what? You're missing information. It doesn't work. And that's what happens when people make arbitrary statements. So the term names a fact about a person's mental actions. All right, let's go forward in the discussion now. We should open up in the book and take a look at page 171. Is science a progression of exploded theories? That's part of what we're getting at in the reading for this week. When I was in college, I considered being a music major, communication major, and a philosophy major. And I talked to one of the philosophy professors, and when I was trying to get to know what kinds of things the school would teach me, he pointed out to me that there is really no certainty about human knowledge, but philosophy seeks to grow human knowledge. But if you look at the history of humanity, we'll see that every couple of hundred years there's a huge paradigm shift. Like, for example, from Newtonian physics to Einsteinian physics. And he held that because Einsteinian physics is correct, then therefore it is discredited Newtonian physics. If you're familiar with the way that the objectivists look at this topic, you would just shudder that they would say that, because you could never have discovered the more specific ideas within Einsteinian physics unless you had already understood Newtonian physics. Newtonian physics is a way of describing our observations within a certain range of normal human parameters. And if you follow the approach that Peikoff gives in this reading, you would see that when Newton stipulated this is the way things work, he only meant within the context of observations we have observed so far. He didn't mean that if you were traveling near the speed of light, that the numbers would still follow the patterns that he was outlining. He didn't necessarily mean that. And any scientist that's being objective didn't necessarily mean that. But now these philosophy guys come and they say, we are going to assume that Newtonian physics was applied in this certain framework, and that therefore Einsteinian physics, which maps certain exceptions, contradicts the old physics. And we are going to assume that there is a paradigm shift every couple of hundred years, and so therefore, yes, science is the progression of exploded theories, and therefore we can never be really certain of anything. Now, I asked him for a reading list, and he has a lot of non-objective philosophies, skeptical philosophies, non-Western philosophies, Buddhist thought, or developing nation philosophies, but clearly not a huge emphasis on Aristotle or even Plato or anything like that. And so I decided not to do a philosophy degree at that school, which was a very good decision. Peikoff's chapter here, the heading is Certainty is Contextual, and we're looking at the question, does reason lead man to certainty? He points out that human knowledge is limited, but that doesn't mean that science or philosophy are a history and a progression of exploded theories. That's not the case. If the person at one point has made observations that within his context, this is how things actually operate, then that is knowledge. And it's immutable knowledge that within the current context, as specified, that's how things operate. The blood type example that he gives is helpful for that. When you look at how originally they discovered that there were these 4 different blood types, A, B, and O, and then they said, within our range of observations, we've noticed that A-type bloods are compatible. Then later on, they became aware of the Rh factor. It could be A positive or A negative. They then became aware that an A positive and an A negative are not necessarily compatible. The negative type can be received by anybody. They came to the realization that there was this other factor conditioning the effects. That doesn't invalidate the previous observations because they were specified within our range of observations. This is what we have seen. There's nothing false about those previous observations. And it was on the basis of those previous observations that they were able to infer that there must be a new factor, the Rh factor.
This is helpful for me because I think this is a weakness in my own understanding. Like if somebody challenged me at this level about, well, isn't everybody's knowledge limited? I would kind of have some weak knees or whatever, but I'm trying to understand more about this idea. Like, is he saying that our knowledge at one stage can never be contradicted by later discoveries? Or because it seems like that in my mind that's still possible. I can understand if it was being constructed this way, like our knowledge at one stage, the facts that led to that conclusion, those facts are like the percepts, like those can't be contradicted. Those things are immutable. But as we discover and collect more data, it augments our understanding. But if we're at the earlier stage and we don't have that new data, we may have conclusions that aren't true when we get the new data. And to me, that says if it's no longer true, the new data now contradicts the old conclusion.
Yes, so you're bringing up the question of when somebody makes an error at one stage and they erroneously claim knowledge. But see, What he's claiming is that knowledge at one level of development will not be contradicted by additional knowledge at a later level of development. He's not saying that falsely attributed knowledge will not be contradicted. When he uses the word knowledge, he means that which actually does map to reality. And we'll get to the definition of knowledge in here, but it is the mind grasping reality. And so if I make an assertion and I feel psychologically certain that this is the case, and it turns out that I was mistaken, then what we have to say is that what I had claimed before was not knowledge. So it's a matter of just getting the terms straight. And this is part of what this material is. The challenge is just making sure that we're using the terms correctly. But we could say that maybe I say right now that I know something is the case. And then later on I find out that I was mistaken. I'm going to have to look back on that and I'm going to have to say I did not know. I thought I knew.
I was mistakenly certain.
Yeah, I claimed knowledge and I claimed it incorrectly. But the point that we're discussing here is not whether or not it's possible to err. Sure, it's possible. But what we are pointing out is that when knowledge is obtained at a specific level, then it is never contradicted when more knowledge is gained. But one of the examples that he mentions, he just briefly mentions how we come to definitions. So remember in the idea from the concept formation chapters, we had talked about how a child would see that his parents are these objects that move around, but then later on you'd realize that there's a difference between human beings and dogs, and then later on he's going to form a more specific definition of what a human being is, rather than it's just this creature that moves around and makes sounds. Now it's capable of speaking, and now it looks a certain way as opposed to the way the dog looks. The point here is the original understanding that the child had of what it was that made his parent is correct. It's just no longer sufficient for distinguishing it from new things, because say he meets grandma and now he has to distinguish grandma from mom. The original conclusion that he had that there is such an entity as his mom and that it meets these specific parameters is correct. But he had to alter his definition to account for new information. That doesn't mean that he altered his concept, he altered his definition. That is an example of this pattern of old knowledge being used to make new knowledge possible, and it doesn't invalidate the old knowledge.
The old knowledge not being invalidated, I think that's the part that I understand, and I understand that as the facts of the matter, the data, the actual data isn't contradicted. You still observed in the blood type example, you still observed the reality that A types are compatible, but only later do you discover that there's two different kinds of A types. So that new knowledge doesn't invalidate the old knowledge. A types are still compatible, but now we know that there's two different kinds of A types. To me, it sounds like more is being said. There's a difference between the facts of the matter, the data, and this may be my misunderstanding of how the terms are being used. It sounds like knowledge has more to do with the data or the percepts itself than it does with a person's understanding of the data or the claims that they associate with that data.
All right, so you might make a statement that all of our observations so far of A types show that they are compatible. Notice how that's different from simply saying all A types under any situation will always be compatible. What we're saying is that the A types that we have observed so far have always been compatible. Now that's the data, and that's not disputable. Whereas, let's say you learn the next piece of information, which is that there's actually these two different factors involved in the A types, the positive and the negative factors. Then you have a new piece of information that there is actually more than one A type. That doesn't invalidate the earlier generalization that the A types we have observed are compatible. Now, if you had tried to hold that earlier generalization as they will always be compatible and there are no other factors, well, that would be an unjustified generalization, because how could you know that? So it's a matter of being precise about what it is that we do and do not know. And as long as you understand that generalizations are to be held in such a way within the context of what I have observed, this is their nature, then there's no falsehood in making that statement. The trouble is that most of the time in human communication, and even in sciences and in philosophy, people don't make it very clear that that's the way they're holding their conclusions. As you can imagine, this would have implications not just for science, but for political topics or theological topics. For example, right now I noticed that there's a discussion on Twitter over whether Timothy Keller is a Christian. And I can say that within the context of all the information that I have about him, that he is somebody who promotes wicked ideas, and that he lies about his opponents, and that he is not teaching what the Bible says, but teaching against what the Bible says, but using sneakiness to try to foist lies on Bible-believing Christians and get them to think that that's what Christianity is. Within the context of all my knowledge, there's no reason to think that he's a Christian. If I were to add up the amount of evidence that he is not a Christian, I would have a big pile of it. If I were to add up the evidence that he is a Christian, I would have very little. I mean, he calls himself a Christian. He was a pastor. He knows how to say what the gospel is. That's a little bit of evidence that he's a Christian. All I can say is that within the basis of my current context, there's no reason to treat him like a Christian. I'm not capable of doing the final judgment. That's not even my job. But I can say that I'm very confident treating him as if he's not a Christian and saying, no, there's no reason to think he's a Christian. Now, if I were to say that to some people, they might think, oh, how can you do that? Don't you leave any room for God? And I just have to reiterate, I am leaving room for God, but I am also refusing to not state that which I know. I'm acknowledging the information that I have, and I'm willing to own that. And that affects the way I would treat him and things I would say about him in public. That's the way that you hold your knowledge objectively. And I think that because people don't have this idea of how knowledge can be held within a specific context, within the context of all I know, this is the conclusion that logically follows. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying that I have all the context that I should have. Just within the context of the information that I have, this is the conclusion that does logically follow. And I am certain that it does logically follow from that context. Let me go in the book a bit more. So this is why he calls his section here certainty as contextual. Because knowledge is contextual. Knowledge is mapping your concepts to the observed data, and the observed data is the context. And if you're not doing that, if you're not showing where the data came from and the extent that the data gives you knowledge, then what you're doing is holding it as an out of context absolute. But he's saying, no. To have knowledge is to connect your claims to context. So certainty itself is going to be contextual. He points out that when we are gaining knowledge, we are reducing ideas to the data of sense, and then we are integrating all of that to all of our conclusions. And he says that that means that you have validated your knowledge. Now, he says, if you consider all the available evidence, and he does employ the method of logic in assessing it, then his interpretation must be regarded as valid. Valid here, and notice he didn't say certain, he just said valid. And he's going to use the term certain in a different sense than maybe we use colloquially. Valid is, in this case, it means demonstrated. He says, logical processing of an idea within a specific context of knowledge is necessary and sufficient to establish the idea's truth. Now, somebody at this point may look at this and say, okay, well then how do you know that you have integrated an idea with the rest of your conclusions? Philosophy cannot answer that in detail for every subject. Within the philosophy of science or within the philosophy of law, there would need to be new theories about what constitutes having demonstrated something. But philosophy can give general guidance on the issue. Now, in the next paragraph, he says, one cannot demand omniscience. And this is the characteristic mistake that we see from a lot of Van Tillians in their epistemologies, that they'll approach you and say, unless you know everything, how could you know that you're right? And this is exactly the opposite of the approach that the objectivists have. They think that knowledge is contextual, whereas the Van Tillians or others that are related ideologically are going to say, no, unless you knew everything simultaneously, you could never have real knowledge of anything. And therefore they create this other theory of how we get knowledge from the one mind that does know everything, by the divine boon theory. So he says, one cannot ask, how do I know that a given idea, even if it has been proved on the basis of all the knowledge men have gained so far, will not be overthrown one day by new information as yet undiscovered? And that amounts to the declaration, human knowledge is limited, so we cannot trust any of our conclusions. Now, see, that just doesn't follow. Now, he does mention that this amounts to taking the myth of what he says, the myth of an infinite God as the epistemological standard by reference to which man's consciousness is condemned as impotent. Now, he doesn't believe in God. I do believe in God. I disagree with him in part, but you can see that on the epistemological point, I actually agree with him. Next paragraph, he says epistemology investigates the question what rules must be followed by a human consciousness if it is to perceive reality correctly. He says if a fact is inherent in human consciousness, that fact cannot be an obstacle to cognition. And he gives a couple of examples: sense perception and logic. And another example is the relationship between emotions. You can read through that, but he gives 3 different examples. Sense perception is part of our method of knowledge. Logic is part of our method. Distinguishing from emotions and thoughts, that's part of our method of knowledge. So none of those can be used as an argument against us having consciousness. It's just that's part of our means of consciousness. Man is a being of limited knowledge, and he must therefore identify the cognitive context of his conclusions, he writes. And then if you skip to we're on the bottom of page 172, he writes, the implicit or explicit preamble to any conclusion must be on the basis of the available evidence. Within the context of the factors so far discovered, the following is the proper conclusion to draw. Now you can say that. You can say that within this context, this is the proper conclusion. Like I can say, within the context of every observation I have about Timothy Keller, the proper conclusion to draw is that he is not a Christian. That's not to say that no information could not arise. Now this is the key to the objectivist theory of scientific induction. It's the key to all of their perspective on induction, is that all we are doing when we make generalizations is we are making a claim about what conclusions follow from the evidence that we so far have. That's all we are doing. And therefore we are entitled to do it. So you would not be entitled to say there's no such thing as black swans. You would be entitled to say we've only ever observed white swans. Top of page 173. If a man follows this policy, he will find that his discoveries at one stage are not contradicted by later discoveries. I think that's pretty clear. He writes, the advanced conclusions augment and enhance his earlier knowledge. They do not clash or annul it. So he is going to explain this blood type thing here, which we've already talked about, so let's skip ahead. Go to page 174. He writes, a man does not know everything, but he does know what he knows. So the choice is not make unwarranted dogmatic claims or give up the cognitive quest in despair. Both of these policies stem from the notion that omniscience is the standard. One side then pretends to have access to it somehow, while the other bewails our lack of such access. So if you're familiar with Van Til, you know they're the side that they claim to have access to it somehow, but it's just the divine boon theory. And then the others that we see today are frequently the skeptics, those who don't believe in knowledge at all. Peikoff writes, if an idea has been logically proved, then it is valid and it is an absolute contextually. So what does he mean by absolute? An absolute here means it's not to be diminished, it's not qualified, it just is. I think that's important to realize. This idea of reason as an absolute we're going to get to in a little bit, but it means not limited, not restricted, not diminished. So your knowledge here is an absolute, and it is an absolute contextually. When you hear that idea, it's an absolute contextually, you might think, what does that even mean? Are you saying that it's certain but kind of? Are you saying that it's an absolute but to be relativized, to be diminished somehow? No, that's not what he's saying. When he says contextually, what he is saying is contextual does not introduce a factor distinct from logic, and it really shouldn't even have to be stressed. He says if you're giving evidence for a conclusion, you're placing it within a context, and you are showing its conditions of its applicability. He's explaining here what he means by contextually. That paragraph is worth thinking through a couple times, I would imagine. He is saying that if an idea has been proved, then it has been shown what its context is. And it is an absolute within that context. Skip to the bottom of 175. He argues that contextualism, as he's been describing, does not mean relativism. You can see why those are two different ideas. It doesn't mean that it's contingent upon somebody's feelings. What he's doing is saying that this knowledge that we have is only knowledge of context. Very bottom of 175, this is sort of a new topic. He brings up this idea of certainty. What is certainty? Now he says certainty is a term that applies only to higher level complex conclusions and only to some of them. I'll give you a little schema to work from. An idea could be validated or not validated. That's the basic idea. But then For some higher level concepts, an idea could be it could be called possible, probable, or certain. And this is only going to apply when there's the kind of conclusion that requires collecting lots and lots of evidence. For example, judging a person's character. It's very difficult to judge a person's character. Say Timothy Keller as the example. If I had read one article from Timothy Keller, that would not be sufficient evidence to form a conclusion about his character, most likely. You need to see a pattern over time, because people act inconsistently sometimes. People make mistakes sometimes. But if you see somebody's character over time, you see what their aim is over time. What's the consistent pattern within all of the decisions that they're making? A similar example would be the American Founding Fathers, noticing over time that there was a consistent pattern in the new laws that were coming at them from the Parliament. They realized every one of these new laws is intent on turning us into serfs. Even if it's only a serf that has to pay 1 cent out of every 100 we earn, you're intentionally trying to encroach and get a little foothold, like a landing territory, intellectually or legally, so that later on you can ratchet it up. And then pretty soon you're going to be taxing us at 40%. They saw the pattern. It takes observations over time to do that. If you were Benjamin Franklin and you noticed that there was this tea tax, and you said, well, it's possible that Parliament is attempting to turn us into serfs. And then you see that they have a stamp tax, and then you realize that it's probable. And then they're sending soldiers to tell you that you have to shut up. Then you know it's certain. So this is the process. And these terms, within the context of this discussion, we cannot outline a recipe for knowing where you draw the line between each of them. These are terms of convention. And it's highly debatable when something has moved from possible to being probable or from probable to being certain. But the use of these concepts, there is something that we can say about it for sure. And that is that you're not allowed to say possible just because something is imaginable. So take an example that Peikoff uses in a different place. Is it possible in normal conditions for ice to sink in water? In the normal conditions that we have, temperature and barometric pressure, and the normal, what water is made of, what ice is made of, is it on Earth under our gravity situation, is it possible for ice to sink to the bottom? The answer is no, it's not possible, and that's a metaphysical possibility. We could imagine it with our minds, that it could sink, that something could happen that breaks the current context. For example, somebody comes and straps on a whole bunch of lead onto the bottom of the ice and then it sinks. Sure, we could imagine that. But within the parameters of what I just explained, it's not possible for ice to sink in water. It's part of the nature of ice that it floats on water. Now, that's metaphysical possibility. There's also epistemic possibility, or what we could refer to as forensic possibility. Like in the case of somebody has been accused of a murder. You could say, is it possible that this person committed the murder? Well, it's metaphysically quite possible for just about anybody to commit a murder. But do we have forensic evidence? Do we have an epistemological justification for saying that this specific person murdered this specific person? And so we distinguish between those ideas. You cannot say possible unless you have evidence specifically for this thing happening in such cases. Yeah, go ahead, Isaac.
This had relevance to me as I was recently encountering and interacting with this false application of total depravity. If you're listening and you're not familiar with what total depravity is, it's the idea that sin has tainted every part of man's nature. And that's what the total means. But some people think that total depravity refers more to a depth than it does breadth, where they think that total depravity means like we're all just really, really sinful. And how can it be so hard to think that we're guilty of certain sins? So they go from taking this concept of total depravity to essentially accusing people of any particular sin that they think people are guilty of. And so when I was reading this, it formulates a very specific standard, epistemological standard, if you ever want to, just because you can think of something's possible. So people go to this concept of total depravity and say, oh, so therefore it's possible that people could be guilty of these sins. No, you actually need to have reason. There needs to be evidence if you want to establish guilt or accuse someone of a specific sin. You can't go from the concept of total depravity and say, oh, therefore it's possible that you are guilty of X sin.
That is a very practical application and timely, for sure. To say that somebody is metaphysically capable of committing whatever sin is totally different from saying, in epistemological sense, we believe that there is some reason to think that you have committed this sin. In the middle of page 176, Peikoff writes, to say maybe in a cognitive context is to make a definite claim. Now, this is just something that, wow, it wouldn't be great if I had been taught this as a kid, but to say maybe is to make a definite claim. It is to assert an idea's positive relationship to the evidential continuum, and like any other cognitive claim, this requires demonstration. And then he talks about what evidence is. It's testimony or facts tending to prove or disprove any conclusion. Bottom of that page, he says, this is why there can be no such thing as some evidence in favor of an entity transcending nature and logic. So he's here going to try to wield what he's explained here about certainty and possibility. He's going to try to argue against God. Again, I'm going to say I agree with part of his criticism of Christianity, and I disagree with part of it, because he understands God as being an entity that transcends nature. If you look at the way he defines nature, he simply means that God is a being that is not limited by cause and effect. And that's not the Christian conception of God. God actually has a certain character, and there are certain things that God cannot do, like God does not lie, God does not do evil. And so we would say that in at least in some sense of the word, God is limited. Now, does that mean that God is not infinite? No, because the Christian conception of the term infinite doesn't mean capable of lying, capable of self-contradiction. Infinite in the Christian conception as applied to God does not even mean that God extends on forever in space. It means that he has all the power that there is. All the power that there is, not the power to lie, not the power to contradict himself, not the power to create a mountain so big that even he cannot move it, not the power to be incoherent. He has all the power that there is. That is the Christian conception of the infinite God. And so if Peikoff, if he were to look at that, he might say, well, then you believe in a God that is bound by nature, that has a nature. And I would say, yes. Now, so we use the term supernatural to mean we believe God has a specific nature, but also that he is powerful over the whole earth. That's what we're talking about when we say supernatural. And so they're going to jump and equivocate or fail to understand what it is that we're saying on the word nature. Go to the next page, 177. There's something called the fallacy of division. If you study logic, the fallacy of division is when you look at, say, the human race is capable of reproducing, and therefore you say this old man who is in a wheelchair is capable of winning a marathon and then giving birth a moment later. Sure, there are people who are capable of winning marathons. There are people capable of giving birth, but you cannot apply anything that is true of humanity as such to a specific individual without checking to make sure that you actually have basis to do so. And if you were to try to do that, it's called the fallacy of division.
I mean, it's just such a hilarious example to that he poses here, and for some people it might be too ludicrous, because why would you ever think that a man in a wheelchair, people can do this? They do commit this error of something's possible, therefore this person can do it. But nobody would ever do that in a hiring process or an interview process. Like when people shift their minds into like their work, they are so much more rational. When you're hiring someone, you would never say you're hired because I've seen man is capable of all the requirements of this job, therefore I'm going to hire you because you're a man. Like, that's completely irrational. You're gonna ask them all kinds of questions. You're gonna get their experience. You're gonna learn what they're capable of, if they're capable for that job. But for some reason, when it comes to all things aside from industry, we commit all kinds of errors like this.
Yes, that's something I've seen within the objectivists. They pointed this out, that if we would only be as rational in all of life as we are in our work. Top of page 178, This is sort of a new topic. Peikoff says, like all cognitive claims, possibilities are asserted within a context. And then he describes this idea of probable. To say that something is probable, that means that there's a substantial body of evidence, that it's not conclusive, but it still supports it. It's a relatively extensive amount. So you can see how this is a matter of convention, and it's somewhat of a borderline issue, but you can say there's a relatively large amount of information. That's what we mean when we say probable. Not yet reaching the standard of proof. Whereas at the bottom of the page, he says certainty means there are complex items of knowledge that are being considered and that add up to a conclusion that cannot be doubted. At this point, we can no longer doubt it. I want to compare this idea to Van Til in that overall approach, biblicist approach, the mystic approach, how they might ask for certainty. They might try to say, Cody, how can you be certain that your senses are not deceiving you? And they would try to use certainty in an attempt to deconstruct my worldview or perspective or belief system. They would say, how can you be certain about these things that are indubitable? And that is an incoherent use of the term certainty. That's why when I do debates with these people, or when I discuss it with people over Facebook or something, I just shrug my shoulders and say, there's too many fires here, because you're using terms in a way that is not consistent with what the terms mean. You don't even know what the term certainty means. It doesn't have to do with the idea of, can I trust my indubitable information like senses? Certainty only applies to higher level conclusions. It's a stolen concept to try to ask, can you be certain of your senses? Now, in an extended sense of the term certain, you can say, sure, free of doubt. I do not doubt my senses. They're indubitable. So in a colloquial sense, you could say certainty means indubitable. But certainty really is intended only to apply to higher level complex conclusions where there is the process of moving from possible to probable to certain. Peikoff writes, a conclusion is certain when the evidence in its favor is conclusive, when it's been logically validated. The total available evidence points in a single direction. This evidence fulfills the standard of proof. There are no longer grounds for doubt. But how would you know specifically whether that's the case of any kind of topic? There needs to be more work done in each individual field in order to know.
There are no longer any grounds for doubt is the key to understanding the differences between possibility, probable, and certain. And Jacob Brutton actually puts this, I think, very succinctly. He wrote in a Facebook status yesterday, doubt as well as belief must be justified. So when we talk about doubt, I think it's helpful to maybe add a modifier there and say justified doubt or rational doubt. The doubt that you push up against a claim must be rational. You must justify that doubt. And the strength of that justification of that doubt determines whether or not that claim is possible, probable, or certain.
Yes, 100%. I was hoping that somebody would bring up that about what Jacob said. You have to have a basis for doubts. Middle of page 179. A defense attorney cannot just say, oh, maybe this happened. That's not valid. That's not a correct approach to knowledge. You have to ask, within the total evidential context, is there objective data to support the hypothesis? Middle of page 180. This is similar to what Jacob was saying. If a skeptic were to say, man does have the ability to impersonate others, so isn't it at least possible that the speaker is an actor? Well, remember the distinction between metaphysically possible versus, is there epistemic justification for the belief? Is there forensic evidence for the belief? And so we would say it's not forensically or epistemically possible in those senses. Top of page 181. We get to the problem of error. The skeptics raise this problem a lot. And you can see the section here where S and O are talking to each other. S would be a skeptic and O would be an objectivist. Man is fallible. Even with the best of training and intentions, he's capable of error. So how can you be certain you're not wrong? Asking him to prove a negative. That's the main issue here. How can you be certain that you're not wrong? And this is what we see from those agnostics that we discussed last week, the pastors that say that we can't really know whether somebody's a Christian or not, just because they're publicly supporting the killing of babies and stuff like that. You think to yourself, are you crazy? But how do they get that? They get that because they say, well, we're capable of making errors, so we don't really know if we're right. And you don't either. And I say, speak for yourself. The response here is man's general capacity to err does not warrant a hypothesis of error in a particular case. Move to the middle of that page. Their whole scam amounts to prove that this non-detectable error does not exist. It's non-objective. And then skip a little more. Doubt, rationally exercised, is a temporary transitional state which is applicable only to some higher level questions. It expresses a cognitive judgment. To say that something is in doubt is a cognitive judgment. Now, you could contrast that sort of epistemic doubt to other kinds of doubts, such as the pathological or neurotic doubt. That's a psychological kind of doubt. The epistemic kind of doubt that we're referring to here is self-limiting, self-correcting. It's a stage which sets up its own conditions for ending it. Now he concludes, is man capable of certainty? And he says the answer is certainly. We go to the next section on page 182, Mysticism and Skepticism as Denials of Reason, and we'll cruise through this fairly briefly. Notice that Ayn Rand gives her definition of knowledge. So it's great, because we're studying philosophy and we have a definition of knowledge. So it's a mental grasp of a fact of reality, reached either by perceptual observation or by a process of reason based on perceptual observation. This is not the conventional philosophical definition of knowledge. The conventional definition is justified true belief. Those are criteria for knowledge. Something that is not a belief, that is not justified, and that is not true should not be classed as knowledge. But the objectivists do not use that as the definition. There's a difference between true characteristics versus the definition. And the reason why they refuse to do that is something we could get into in more detail later, but the concept of belief should not be used in the definition of knowledge because the concept of belief is hierarchically higher than the concept of knowledge. You shouldn't use a hierarchically more complex concept like belief within the definition of a concept if you can avoid it. They will say, sure, knowledge does need to fit those tests, but this is not the definition. Knowledge is grasp of a fact. Now, what is a grasp? At some point, it becomes irreducible because we're talking about something that is an irreducible axiom, consciousness. You could say that knowledge is consciousness of facts, but you cannot go further in defining consciousness in terms of other more fundamental pieces. You can give only an ostensive definition of things like consciousness or grasp. Peikoff writes, this definition, which the discussion so far has validated, can serve as a summary of the objectivist epistemology. He puts in these little sentences that are so fast you could breeze over them, but he said a lot there. We have, in the past 182 pages, validated this definition of knowledge. And in doing so, we have summarized the objectivist epistemology. That's what the objectivist epistemology prescribes for us to do, is to grasp the facts of reality by observation or by a process of reason based on observation. That's the whole prescriptive idea of objectivist epistemology. Now you can contrast that with some other theories. Mysticism would refuse to say that we grasp knowledge only by observation and reason. Mysticism would say there's some other facts as well that come in, like the divine boon. And so you get this from the Van Tillians. They will not say that there's no knowledge that comes from observation, but they would say that there's some knowledge which doesn't come from it. So Peikoff writes, mysticism is the theory that man has a means of knowledge other than sense perception or reason, such as revelation, faith, intuition, and the like. And it amounts to emotionalism. And we've described that in previous weeks. Now, I don't take the same dark view or dim view of revelation as Peikoff does here, but if we're talking about revelation by the divine boon theory, then I agree with him. He points out that there's a connection between mysticism and intrinsicism because it amounts to just knowing. And I've seen people do this. I've seen people say, well, when I read the Bible, whatever thoughts come to my mind, I know that that's from God. Or whatever impressions I get, or somebody makes a comment and then I make an interpretation of that comment. You would almost have a hard time believing that it's true, but it is true. People really do think this way and act this way about knowledge. The more you talk to people, you realize people actually do follow this pattern, and some of them will even say that they do. They just think that their automatic reactions generate knowledge, and that that's the voice of God. Peikoff points out that mysticism's advice amounts to, it's not necessary to question or validate your ideas. Unfortunately, this idea is so prominent within the church. There are people that because the pastor says it, they do not question it. To such people, I say, you're not willing to ask yourself what's true. You're not actually willing to seek the truth here, because your functional way of approaching the truth is my pastor said it, therefore it's true. Peikoff says that this kind of approach to knowledge amounts to, my goal is mentally to be just like an animal, following my feelings. That's the mystic approach. Now, the skeptic approach, he says that amounts to making a goal of being as much as possible like a vegetable, which is, we don't think that there is knowledge at all. We don't think it comes by any means at all. So he talks about skepticism. He contrasts mysticism and skepticism. They're both doing something promiscuous. The mystic promiscuously accepts ideas, and the skeptic promiscuously doubts them. Just like the quote that we had from Jacob earlier. You need to be able to justify doubt. They're actually two sides of the same coin. Yes, Isaac.
What's that quote from Ayn Rand that you frequently share with me? We were talking about the other day. It's about if you don't follow reason, you aren't living, something like that.
The man who says, "Who am I to know?"
Yeah.
Is when he says that, he's saying, "Who am I to live?"
Yeah. So the man who says, "Who am I to know?" is effectively saying, "Who am I to live?" And I've struggled to, like, when I've encountered that or read that, I'm like, this is profound, but I don't really understand it fully. And I think that this part here contextualizes it perfectly. The skeptic who is a vegetable, who's dead, doesn't live. They just do nothing because they can't do anything with their knowledge. They don't want to do anything. They just stand there and they're skeptical of everything. They're vegetables. And then the mystics, they're running around like animals, like a dog, like, go fetch. According to their own whims or somebody else's whims, are they really living? They're not. They're subject to arbitrary things. They're not living a full, meaningful life. And it's the man who thinks according to reason is the one who truly lives.
Yes, and when they say live, they're talking about living as a man. That's the implied thought there, living as a man. There's some other thoughts that come to my mind about that, but I think one of the main points that I just want to make is every creature has a means of survival, whether it's the dog's strength or teeth or the spider's web. And for the human being, the means of survival is thinking. When somebody says, "Who am I to know?" they're saying, "Who am I to think?" which amounts to, "Who am I to live as a man?" That's what they're saying. Middle of 183, Peikoff writes, "Faith means acceptance on the basis of feelings rather than of evidence." Okay, so if that's what faith means, then I reject faith. That's not what faith means on the traditional Christian view of it. Let's go into that just a moment. Faith has an etymology, and you can learn a lot about the idea from its etymology. What does it mean when a wife is faithful to her husband? Faithful means that she acts in a way that can be trusted. She adheres to him and not to some other man. So when we speak of a wife being faithful, we mean that she's acting in such a way that she doesn't leave him. Christians believe in being faithful to God, acting in such a way that we don't go seeking other gods. So we are being faithful. Now, what does it mean to act in good faith? If you have an employee in the workplace and you say they were acting in good faith, that just means that they were not trying to lie or cheat. They may have made a mistake. They may have destroyed company property by accident, but they were acting in good faith. They tried. In other words, they were not going wayward from their commitment. Faith, in the Christian sense, means that you are not going to go wayward from your commitment to your God. And when we say that we have faith, this is because we believe that he's not going to go wayward from his commitment to us. We trust him. We believe that he's not going to let us down. So we place our faith in him. Now, if I were to say in a regular human relationship, to say somebody in the workplace, have faith in me, am I asking them to believe me on the basis of my request? Or am I asking them to believe me on the basis of their knowledge of me? So if you were to just forget the religious aspect of what these terms mean and just ask yourself, in normal, ordinary speech, is there a use for the term faith or faithful, faithfulness? Yes. And these are things that are reasonable. It's reasonable to put faith in people. It's reasonable to be faithful to people. Now, you import this term over into the religious context, and you say, is it reasonable to believe that God is going to follow his promises? Yes, it is. Is it reasonable to maintain our adherence to this God? Yes, it is. And that's what we mean when we speak of faith. Totally different from the kind of faith that Peikoff is attacking here. Sadly, though, the kind that he's attacking here is the more common understanding of faith that we see, at least recently, the last several hundred years. The irrationalist approach to religion. Bottom of 183, a process of proof commits a man to its presuppositions and implications. And so he's reducing the mystics and the skeptics' ideas about those to absurdity. Top of 184, he does mention that he thinks that to be reasonable or objective is incompatible with believing in miracles, revelations. He calls them the paraphernalia of unreason, mysteries transcending nature and science. And he thinks that if there were a God that could be grasped by the reasonable mind, then that would be not the kind of God that Christians are looking for. And sadly, throughout Christian history, that's true. There are many Christian mystics in the history of Christian thought that once somebody were able to say, we have a philosophical conviction about God, their response would be, that's not the God that I want. He quotes Pascal's cry, not the God of the philosophers, but the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, I don't know where Pascal stood on this. My impression of my reading of Pascal and his approach to apologetics is that he was reasonable. And I think that people have even, if you were just to take Pascal's wager and look at it in isolation, you might say, well, that's not necessarily following all the rules of sound epistemology. But if you look into Pascal, he wasn't using it in such a way that breaks the rules of sound epistemology. You can find information about that in John Warwick Montgomery in his material on apologetics. He's interested in the history of apologetics, and he does a good job explaining that Pascal was not being a mystic either. So what was Pascal saying when he says, not the God of the philosophers, but the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? I don't think that Peikoff knows what Pascal was saying. And I think as rationally minded Christians, we can probably come to some guesses about what Pascal meant. Probably that he was rejecting the rationalistic schemes of his contemporaries. Middle of this page, the essence and purpose is escape from reason, or escape from the absolutism of reason. So he speaks of the absolutism of reason. The absolutism meaning that reason is not to be diminished or restricted or limited as our standard, as our method. That's not to say that reason is our source. And that's a distinction that we always get into with the Van Tillians. Reason is not our source of knowledge. It is our method of knowledge. It must be used as our method of knowledge because the only alternative is emotion or some form of arbitrary assertion based on emotion. And he points out correctly, no one seeks to reject reason completely. What many men do seek, however, is not to be straitjacketed by reason all the time in every issue, 24 hours a day. It is to these men that mystics and skeptics alike offer a sanction and a loophole. And he has this whole section here where he explains how once you introduce some other standard in that is going to determine whether or not you're going to follow reason, then you've effectively sunk the whole ship of reason. You can pretend to use reason, but you're not actually using it. He points out in the middle of 185, when such a man may very well invoke the recital of evidence, it's not an expression of the principle of objectivity. You're just using it as a cheater, as a facade. And you see that within the presuppositional approach to social justice warriors. They'll use reason when they want, sort of as a show. And I think that that's what precept ultimately amounts to as well. Any kind of precept, even Christian precept. It's emotionalism. It's following the ideas based on their emotional congeniality. But Peikoff advocates, no, we must follow the absolutism of reason. This is something that, as a Christian, I know that if I say I believe in the absolutism of reason, people will look at me and they'll say, so you believe in autonomous human reason? And I'll say, I believe in thinking and following the evidence where it leads. I believe in the sanctity of truth. I believe in thinking independently. I believe that thinking independently means placing myself under the authority of what God has revealed. If you say autonomous means not trying to be under what God has revealed, no. The one who is autonomously reasoning, the one who is reasoning independently, thinking about what is true, seeking the truth, doing their best to be honest, that is the one that is most under the authority of God and all that God has revealed. So I don't understand the accusation. But those who reject autonomous reasoning, almost for sure, are rejecting the idea of reasoning as such. And that's why they have these other theories. Any more discussion on these topics before we wrap up our video this week?
I don't have it totally figured out, just like a thought to throw out there. It seems like there's some context dropping happening there when they accuse you or us of autonomous thinking, human reasoning. It's similar in my mind to the idea of Peikoff saying that if God is infinite, that means he can make a mountain so big that he can't move it. The accusations there seem similar, like there's some context dropping going on.
When I hear the accusation that I'm trying to reason autonomously, I just laugh it off. You don't know what your words mean. You don't have any idea what you think you're saying. Whatever it is that I am doing, whatever terms you want to use to describe it, I'm seeking reality and I'm using my mind. And if you have a problem with that, then you have a problem with me living as a human being. And that's your problem, that's not mine. All right, well, thank you everybody for watching this week. I appreciate you, and you can get all the replays and you can register for future weeks. We discuss Ayn Rand's work here all throughout this year, throughout the month of August 2022 at 9 a.m. Eastern on Saturdays. And you can go to christianintellectual.com/objectivism to get all of that information. I will talk to you soon. God bless.